Welcome to Naked Age, a nudist history series exploring uncommon stories and profiling unique people who have gone to extraordinary lengths to live a nude life. I'm your host, Evan Nix. In this episode, we'll meet Dennis Craig Smith, a longtime naturist advocate who wrote the book on naturism in the family. This is Naked Age.
You're listening to Naked Age.
Just as I was preparing to sit down and record this episode this week, though it will have been a little longer by the time you listen, a clip from the popular daytime TV series The View was being passed around on the internet, and it caught my attention for reasons that'll become clear. I'll let the show's longtime host, Joy Behar, explain.
Here's a question for the assembled. Do you enjoy walking around naked in your own home?
Sarah.
Okay. Well, you have notable company because in a recent podcast interview, Oscar nominee Bradley Cooper revealed that he's totally comfortable strolling around his house in his birthday suit. He says his late dad always did the same thing while he was growing up. So I asked the panel, would you be comfortable with this?
But the issue that the point that we didn't talk about is that he's walking around naked in front of his small children.
Well, the kid is 6, yeah, and it's
that's a small child.
Sarah, can you
I wanted
relate?
to spare the embarrassment, but thank you for
Okay,
sharing.
I'm going to clarify. I do not enjoy...
Joy's co-host, Sarah Haynes, went on to explain that she doesn't really find nudity in the home to be all that wrong.
I do not cover myself up immediately between the shower and my lotions when my kids come running in because I have made a deliberate effort for them to not feel shamed of their bodies and to remind them that it's science. I breastfed in front of each kid as they came around, never hid it.
Interestingly, this position was met with resistance from the other women on the panel, who questioned their co-host choices in so many words.
I don't want them to cover up out of shame.
How much have they seen?
Wait, this is way more beautiful than you described it this morning. This morning you sounded like a weird
She makes it
exhibitionist.
sound like I'm an exhibitionist.
But have they seen private parts?
They've seen anything they can see while I'm putting on my lotion. They don't look at me. They're screaming like, come get mad at me.
This would be different if they were like maybe 12-year-olds and at that
Yeah,
age where you
still a
start
kid,
thinking of
baby.
things like that, but little kids. But I'm so prude, like my puppy will run in and I'm like, oh, sorry, Herbie.
No,
Who knows?
This sort of confused indignation that Sarah Haynes faced on The View might be familiar to naturist parents, who, by and large, hold similar values of fostering body positivity and rejecting body shame in the household as a healthy way to raise kids. For some, like Bradley Cooper or Sarah Haynes, it's perfectly normal to be nude around your family. But for others, it's viewed as weird. In this common clash between naturist family values and broader societal skepticism, the quest for empirical clarity has never been more pressing. Today, conspiracy theories and groomer panic influence legislative efforts to ban nudity, all under the guise of protecting the children. But for nearly a century, nudism as a social movement and its advocates have touted its significant social, health, and psychological benefits, including for families and children. Yet, much of this argument rests on anecdotal evidence, people's experiences, rather than on solid scientific studies. To combat misconceptions, naturists need real data that supports the argument that naturism is a positive, a net good. And if real data suggests the opposite, naturists want to know that too. Though there aren't many, as it exists today, there have at least been a handful of research efforts that serve to shed light on the effects of naturism on children. This episode takes a look at the evolution of such studies, revealing what has been learned as it examines the question, does nudity harm kids? And after that, we'll offer a personal perspective from Dennis Craig Smith himself on his contributions to this enlightening debate with his study and subsequent 1986 book, Growing Up Without Shame. And all of this is coming up right after this.
If you're someone who's ever wondered about the cultural aspects of nudity and art in the world, look no further than Planet Nude. At Planet Nude, we go beyond skin-deep discussions of nudism and delve into the current cultural, intellectual, and philosophical topics around nudity. exploring the way it's been used in art and activism, and the impact it has in our lives today. With a diverse group of contributors, Planet Nude brings thought-provoking essays and art uncovering everything from the history of nudism to the latest news. Join the close free conversation at Planet Nude by subscribing on Substack today at planetnude.co. See you on Planet Nude.
Mark Storey is known to many naturists, especially American naturists, as a seasoned historian of nudist culture and an editor of N Magazine, the quarterly magazine produced by the Naturist Society. It's for the Naturist Society that Mark, since 2020, has produced a regular monthly Zoom seminar series exploring the history and culture of nudism, called, fittingly, Exploring Nudist Culture with Mark Storey. Now, obviously, I'm like the perfect target audience for this kind of niche content, so it should be no surprise that I look forward to attending these seminars whenever I'm able to, which isn't often enough. But every time I do, I'm struck by the amount of information Mark knows and shares, and I'm always amazed by the numbers he regularly draws out to these Zoom events on a weeknight. Clearly, there's an appetite for the history that he shares. Not long ago, Mark started featuring guests on this series, and the content has become even more compelling. Recently, I tuned in for a presentation by the author Dennis Craig Smith on his 1986 book, Growing Up Without Shame, which, as we've established already, explores the effects of naturism on children who grew up in naturist environments. I'd read Dennis's book before, curious as a parent and as a naturist to learn more about the topic, and realizing that there were few written resources on the subject. The book was excellent and provided some important perspectives and insights, but it also left me wanting more information, more study into this topic. So when I saw Mark was hosting Dennis in his series, I was excited by the prospect of hearing his personal story about how his book came to be. I was captivated by Dennis's telling of his story and moved by his takeaways. So I reached out to Mark Storey to congratulate him on a great event and learn more about his process. I guess just to start, I'll say I very much enjoy your End Zoom series.
Oh, sure.
How did that start?
Yeah, clearly, it was COVID. The Naturist Society wanted to do some extra things for its membership. And though I'm no tech person, I saw that something like a Zoom teleconference could be something that would be nice for members. It started off as not a book reading group, but just an hour a month where I would give some background information about key authors and the books and give people a chance to offer their comments or ask questions, and I could answer as best as we could. And that went on for a couple of years. And then it became pretty clear I wasn't running out of books, and I still have an interest in that, but I think other people would like to have other ideas and hear other voices. If you've been there, you know this is incredibly low tech. Carmen Ham does all the tech work from Wisconsin. I just show up and start yammering. But it's been fun.
I notice it seems every year you publish your list of the books you're going to go over in your series. How do you normally come together with that initial list of books every year?
Purely my interest. The first 2.5 years or so was pretty much books. And I've got a pretty good library of books pertaining to nudism, in English anyway. So I'm aware of what's out there. And I just wanted to let people know that there were some really important books that had a huge impact on a number of people, nudists and outside of nudism.
What specifically drew you to Growing Up Without Shame as a book?
Dennis was he's been a friend of mine for a long time and a bit of a hero even longer than that. He's certainly been active in Southern California, naturist activism with hot springs, nude beaches. As I got older and became more interested in nudist research, I kept running across his name. And his book, Growing Up Without Shame, certainly super important, clearly his most famous written work. You would have a hard time finding any academic person writing or publishing on children and nudity without at least referring to Dennis's book at this point. It's a well-researched book in the sense that he and Sparks did a lot of interviewing of nudist families, nudist children, and people who grew up nudist and were now adults. So it's largely anecdotal, which is a strong side of psychological and sociological studies. And he got Dr. Sparks involved, who was interested in it, and Sparks said, oh, okay, this is actually good data, let's work with it. And Sparks was able to provide the more, if you'd call some professional sociological aspects of the research. So as a team, they did a nice job of just describing what it was like to grow up a nudist. Not so much nude. There are some psychologists and sociologists who study children's response to nudity. It just isn't quite the same thing as children's response to nudism. Because nudity can be good, bad, and different. It might be nudist, it might not. If mom's practicing pole dancing on a regular basis, the kid might be exposed to nudity, but it's not being exposed to nudism. They were interested, Sparks and Smith were interested in children who had background in nudist contexts.
When it came to the effects of just about anything on children, most parents of the mid-20th century turned to the advice of Dr. Benjamin Spock. As a pioneer of pop medicine, his influence shaped the discourse on child rearing in the mid-20th century. Merv Griffin didn't mince words when he had Spock on his show in 1966.
As it is well known, George Washington is the father of our country. But there is a man here who comes in a close second. As a father, I will tell you. This man's book is only outsold in the history of books by one other. The top-selling book in the world is the Bible. The second bestseller belongs to Dr. Spock, his books on child care.
Writing about Spock for N magazine in 1999, Mark Storey said,
Benjamin Spock did not create the legend that children are harmed by seeing their parents nude. He does, however, deserve the credit for doing more than anyone else to spread and legitimize the misconception in the minds of American parents, pediatricians, and popular columnists. Nudity in the home was not highlighted by Spock as a major issue. Nonetheless, he felt the need to address nakedness in nearly every one of his books. Spock's point of view is drawn from a fundamental Freudism, which he only slightly revised over the years.
How many children to research to get the facts you've come up with?
Well, I used to practice pediatrics in New York City from about 1933 until 1947. That's where I learned everything that I knew.
In the court of public opinion, it doesn't matter if prevailing notions are factually based for them to be believed widely. Most naturist parents and kids who have partaken in family nudism would reject with prejudice the notion that it causes harm. The problem is that without legitimate scientific study, it's hard to argue whether it is or it isn't. And when challenging the prevailing notions, you need to have data. Even today, actual research on child exposure to non-sexual nudity is scarce. Yet, a few notable studies provide insight. Here's a 2-minute history of these studies. One of the first academic perspectives was written by Sandor Lorand, who in the 20th century explored the psychological aspects of exposure to nudity.
Psychoanalytic Review of 1933. He publishes this article saying, it seems to me from my experience with patients who had something to do with nudity, had nothing to do with nudism. He said, it seems to me that nudism itself doesn't really have anything to do with whether somebody's going to grow up with psychological problems or not. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. There just isn't any empirical evidence. So his conclusion was just completely neutral in this article. But that was 1933. He didn't have much to say because he didn't have much experience with nudism. It was just too darn new in the United States.
In the 1960s, a study published by Martha Olenek and others examined early socialization experiences in children, comparing psychiatric outpatients to non-psychiatric patients. The research sought to determine the impact of children seeing their parents naked. No significant differences were found. In 1970, William Hartman, Marilyn Fithian, and Donald Johnson conducted a study on nudism through surveys and participant observations, funded in part by Long Beach State College. Their findings, which they published in a book called The Nudist Society in 1971, highlighted that nudist children are often perceived as having lower involvement in delinquent behavior and benefit from an environment fostering responsibility and trust. In the 1980s, the studies ramped up. Marilyn Storey conducted pivotal research into how being raised in naturist environments impacts children. Her findings indicated that such children often developed healthier body images and higher self-esteem compared to those not exposed to naturism. In 1986, Dennis Craig Smith and Dr. William Sparks explored how naturism affects children in growing up without shame. Their findings indicated naturist children have better body image and self-esteem. In 1988, Robin Lewis and Luis Yonda explored how childhood nudity exposure and parental attitudes toward sexuality affect adult sexual health. They discovered these experiences don't negatively impact and may even positively influence adult adjustment. Paul Okami's work in the 1990s through an 18-year longitudinal study found no detrimental effects on children exposed to parental nudity. More recently, in the 20-teens and 2020s, Dr. Keon West's studies have underscored the potential benefits of naturist activities, also suggesting they can improve body image and self-esteem.
All these guys are responding to the concern that people like Spock and his minions and Lander and whatnot would say that nudity in the house is horrible for kids. You should stop doing it after they turn 3. They were never quite clear what bad things would happen, but they knew it was bad. It was probably Freudian. So all these studies are saying this is what is being said. We suspect the opposite is the case. And so we're going to do this study and see what happens. And all the studies up through the 90s and actually up through last year are indicating that just exact opposite's the case. Either that there's no impact whatsoever on the kid, or there might actually be some benefit. Everything that Dennis Craig Smith was saying in his book is coming out, is being verified by the most recent studies.
Time now to bring this back to Dennis Craig Smith, the naturist author who, along with psychologist Dr. William Sparks, has been one of the only researchers to set out to study the lived effects of growing up in a naturist environment with his 1986 book, Growing Up Without Shame. Let's let Mark Storey have the honors of introducing him. Any other words that you think are important to say about Dennis himself?
He's a quiet fellow who has a lot to say. He's quite willing to sit back and let others have the first word out. But if I'm in the room, I'm always just waiting to hear what he has to say. He's always got something interesting to say, an interesting slant from some key player that he knows intimately or some key activity that he was involved in, and I had no idea he was there, but there's an interesting event. My God, he seemed like he was always there. He was at the very first Nature Society gathering in Elysium, and he just was always there participating, sometimes giving presentations, giving lectures. I just find him to be a remarkable guy.
The following audio of Dennis Craig Smith comes from Mark Storey's Zoom series Exploring Nudist Culture, April 12, 2023, and is used courtesy of the Naturist Society Foundation.
My name is Dennis Craig Smith. I've been a naturist since the first gathering in 1980 at Elysium. I've written articles for Clothes for the Sun and magazine Health and Efficiency. Bear in mind, I've done presentations at gatherings since 1980, from Los Angeles to Pennsylvania, from San Diego to Idaho. I've been a speaker at Lupin, Olive Dell, Glen Eden, Sun Meadows, Laguna del Sol, De Anza Springs, and Elysium. I got on this 50-year cruise writing about children and nudity when I was in a doctor's office in 1976, and I picked up a magazine, Red Book, and it had an article by Dr. Benjamin Spock, and it was entitled, Parents Warned Against Nudity. And I took the magazine home after the doctor's office because I hadn't finished reading it. But in the article, Dr. Spock warned parents about exposing their children to their parents' nudity. When I listened or I read his explanation of how he came to that conclusion, it didn't sound very scientific to me. He was shaving. His son was 3 years old. Spock said he was nude. The son came in and struck at his penis, obviously resentful, he said. Obviously resentful? Really? Is a scientist saying this? So I couldn't get that out of my mind. So I wrote Spock through Red Book, and basically I got an answer back that said, who the hell are you? This is Dr. Spock we're talking about. And I had only wanted to know what references, what empirical study he'd used. Besides his bathroom episode, I got no answer at all. There was also the experts, and the experts were just piled up behind Spock, telling parents, for heaven's sakes, don't expose your children to your nudity. There was Joyce Brothers, who said that parents who did were unconsciously seducing their children. Seducing their children? Fitzhugh Dobson, who wrote How to Father, How to Parent, How to Mother, where he said, after 3, do not let your children see you nude, because you can cause them harm. There was somebody that kept being quoted over and over, Dr. Sandor Lorand, who in 1932 went to a nudist camp in New Jersey, Sky Farm, and he spent a day observing. And he said he observed uncomfortable children. And he was the first to say that if parents did this, they were unconsciously seducing their children. So it was just revolving quotes. People were not studying the issue, they were just quoting each other. So with this idea of an article, I went to a friend of mine, Dr. William Sparks, who was a psychologist who specialized in human sexuality. And I said, would you help me with this? And he wasn't very encouraging. He said, actually, you don't know anything about doing research. You're a 4th grade teacher. You have no experience in gathering empirical material. So I don't advise you doing this. So that challenged me, and I went home and wrote a questionnaire over the weekend. And then I started going to nudist camps. And 6 months later, I returned with 78 completed questionnaires from adults who were raised as nudists. One of the people we went to see with this idea of mine for an article was Ed Lang at Elysium. And my wife and I met with Ed and his assistant and a couple filmmakers. And after we discussed this for a while, Ed said, don't write an article, write a book. What can a young writer do with a challenge like that? You know, write a book. So I thought, maybe I'll write a book. Our idea about the book was just to look at the research and find out if parents who allowed their children to see them nude or see other adults nude were harming their children. But as I said, our first goal was just to read the literature, just to look at what had been studied. And of course, the problem was there was no evidence. There were no studies. There was no empirical information at all. Not for Spock, not for Brothers, not for Dodson, not for Sandor Lorand, nothing. So there we were. We had our project in go. The book was first published in 1982 as The Naked Child. And the problem with that was this was right about the time of the McMartin preschool scandal.
The McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. The scene, it is alleged, of one of the biggest and most bizarre cases of sexual abuse of children in anyone's memory.
And we had a picture of a naked baby on the front. There were book distributors who wouldn't touch it. Book people from Palo Alto said we wouldn't touch that project with a 10-foot pole. So it was very difficult getting distribution. After the book came out in 1982, published by 20th Century Publishers in Palo Alto. But then Ed Lang came along and he bought the rights to the book in 1986. The book was then republished as Growing Up Without Shame. There were chapters added, an index, a chapter by Dr. Sparks, Bill Sparks had helped me with the actual questionnaire and running the data. And they added photos. Our opening chapter, we wanted to be about the typical nudist family. So we met with a couple that had a young daughter. We named the couple the Johnsons. That's not their name, but we named the daughter Bonnie. And it just occurred to me when I started writing this, that this last year, Bonnie just turned 52. We wanted to write about what the family went through, what kind of struggles with friends and family, what kind of activities they went to. They were naturists, belonged to Elysium, and they had birthday parties for Bonnie at the grounds, swim parties, sleepovers. What struck us the most, the Johnsons looked like just about every other family with a 7-year-old daughter, except they were naked together for recreation. That seemed to be all the only difference. Our chapter 2, we wanted to be about talking and listening to the people who grew up as nudists. So that chapter is entitled From These Children Came Naked Adults. And we started off with a woman named Grace. She was 25, college student, raised as a nudist. She planned to raise her children as nudists. She was a student at USC. And we talked to Mandy, who was 30, an activist family. Her mother was a member and board member of ASA, American Sunbathing Association, which later changed their name to ANNR, American Association of Nude Recreation. We talked to Deborah, who was a high school educated 35-year-old married mother of 3. She was raising her children as nudists. And we asked her, I like the answer to this. We asked her about Freud's penis envy. I don't know where that came from, something Bill thought up. And she said, well, I always felt I was a little better designed than someone with dangly things between their legs. We talked to David, who was a 22-year-old, 2 years of college, enthusiastic supporter of nudism who planned to raise his children as nudists. Altogether in that chapter, we talked to 30 adults, and all of them said they planned to raise their children as nudists. The next chapter, chapter 3, was the body taboo, and this led to my third book, because what we realized, we'd known all our lives, but there was this hostility in our society against the human body, really hostility. I mean, laws that forbid exposure. We wrote about a couple that came from France, came to the LA Coliseum, and next to the 2 new statues at the Coliseum, a male and a female statue, this couple took off their clothes, but they had their underwear on, but they were arrested. They were arrested next to a nude statue. And this dichotomy, this reverence for the body in art and condemnation in the flesh, just set off alarms. One of the more alarming aspects of this whole book project was the Andrews family. We renamed them, but this couple, Carl and Andrew, had 2 children, 9 and 11. And a neighbor, evidently, reported them for child abuse because they let their children see them nude. They were members of Elysium. And their children were taken from them for 2 years. For 2 years, they were without their children because someone said that having the children see the nude adults was abusing the children. Now, I know that CPS, Child Protective Services, does some good. It it does. It works for children, but it also has done some mighty harm. I testified in the court for this couple as the author of Growing Up Without Shame, and my problem was, or our problem was, that we were just countered by an expert that the prosecution brought in. The man had been retired for 10 years, and he was testifying that the research says this is harmful. He had no research to quote, but that was the extent of it. The Andrews got their children back in 2 years. There were no charges filed ever. They just lost their children. It's a very typical story. One of the most interesting things for us, of course, in terms of the project, was the results that we got from the sampling we did. We compared our results to a different number of different studies. One of them was we compared our adolescents answers to the Sorensen study of adolescent sexuality and Hartman and Fithian's research and a study of college-age students. And one of the things that Hartman and Fithian found, and we found the same thing, was even though Spock and Brothers and Dodson warned against this, that it would cause terrible problems, the divorce rate actually was lower among nudists than it was in the regular society, about 5% lower. Even though Brothers warned that you would be unconsciously seducing your children if you allowed them to see you nude, the incest was far lower among nudists than it was the general population. Now, the breakdown of all of these is in this chapter on the results in our book. One interesting thing for us was that of the nudist respondents, there was a higher percentage of college-educated people. 50% of our respondents were college-educated, 30% were high school only, and 12% were neither. We asked our respondents, how would you describe your sex life at this time of your life as an adult? It was interesting to us that 42% of our group said they would describe their sex life as extremely satisfying. Of the comparison group, the college-educated adult study said 28% of that group would describe their sex life as extremely satisfying. 6.7% of our nudist group said their sex life was non-existent. But almost 18% of the comparison group said they had a non-existent sex life. And we asked them, do you think being raised a nudist had any bad effects on your life? Well, we did get some yes. 0.05% said yes. 88.3% said no. A small percentage didn't answer. After the book was out, I appeared on the Sally Jesse Raphael program out of Connecticut. They were going to have 5 people on the show who were nude.
This is Dennis Craig Smith, and Dennis has written a book about the naked child. And so we are also going to talk about 2 of you have children who are nudists.
They asked me if I would appear nude. And I said, no, I had written a book that I wanted to be taken seriously, and I didn't think that would help being taken seriously. But I would be there and I would talk about it, and the host kept referring to the group that I belonged to as naturalists. And I kept telling her that naturalists studied birds and flowers and penguins, but she kept calling us naturalists, even though I said, no, we're naturists. Now, as I said, 5 people on the show were nude, 2 men and 3 women. But what was interesting to me was that the audience kept calling for me to take it off, to get naked. Something that's illegal to do in public, immoral to do for a lot of people, but they wanted me to do that. Now, after the Sally Jesse Raphael show, we went out into the parking lot where the audience was gathered, and they were treating us as if we were celebrities. And there was a group of women, about 15 of them, surrounding the 3 women from the show. And there was a lady that was probably in her 90s, holding all 3 of their hands. And she said, "Darlings, you were wonderful. Having the nerve to do what you did was marvelous." She then turned to me, this 90-year-old lady, and said, "But you weren't worth a damn." Her daughter quickly assured me that what she meant was, "You didn't get naked." So I tried to gather some dignity and shuffle off. But at least it showed us that the audience had respected what happened, and they had listened, and they weren't nudists, but they gave us some good, positive comments afterwards. All of the time I was doing this research, I had drummed into me by, especially Bill, Dr. Sparks, that I needed to be impartial, which I pretty much couldn't be. I tried hard to be fair. So when I was asked on a radio program if I were a nudist, I said no. I didn't belong to the nudist group. I was a naturist, but he didn't ask me if I was a naturist. He said, "Are you a nudist?" And I said no. And on the way home, my wife said, "You know, when you told him you weren't a nudist, if there is anyone in this world who is a nudist, it's you. You're nude 90% of the time at home, whether you're a member or not." Well, of course, she was right. I wore one. Shortly after that radio program, I joined ASA, American Sunbathing Association, which later became ANNR. But I had been a naturist since 1980, when Lee Boxendahl and Ed Lang invited me to the first gathering. And I spoke there, gave a presentation on the research that we were involved in. Children who were raised nudists were said by Dr. Spock to have difficulty in school. But we found the opposite was true. Nudist children, are, at least the ones we looked at, actually did better than average in school. Even though I wasn't impartial and I was trying hard to look at all possibilities, the evidence still seemed to be clear. And we found that naked people were less hung up on the indecency of any particular part, where the non-nudists felt, as a rule, there were parts of the body that were indecent. And we had found, as I said, that higher educated people were more apt to be nudists. We found that they were more comfortable with being naked regarding sexual matters. So to Spock's opinion of it causing terrible guilt and frustrations, that simply wasn't true, at least not by what we saw. A little after our study was published, Dr. Mark Storey did a study from Northern Iowa University where she studied the nudist children's self-concept. And she found and reported in Society for Scientific Study of Sex in San Diego in 1992 that she found the nudist children to be more self-assured, that the children seemed to be at ease emotionally, as opposed to what Spock had warned and Brothers had warned and Dodson had warned and Sandra Laurent had warned. We feel good about what the book had at least done. We felt that it had established a dialogue, and many studies came along after our book was published. Now, it has been a terrific ride these 40 years, writing about and speaking to non-nudist groups and promoting a sane and level-headed approach to the human body. The book was never meant to be the definitive answer to the question. are you harming your children? But it was meant to start a dialogue, and we feel so good that the dialogue has certainly been started. Being around naked adults and other children does not seem to harm children. They are not plagued by, as Spock said, terrible guilt and frustrations. Nudist camps did not seem to be filled with sexual deviance. They seem to look like pretty normal people. Except they recreated naked.
As I suggested earlier in the episode, the research studies that have been conducted around children in naturism had sort of its heyday, if you can call it that, in the 70s and especially the 80s. And the work that Smith and Sparks did was pivotal to that surge, if you can call it that. And it is to this day possibly the most directly applicable to naturists and to families, though the recent work of Dr. Keon West is to be lauded in this regard as well. But still, it begs this question. Why haven't there been more studies on children and naturism? Mark Storey has one theory.
There hasn't been a lot of studies, other than Keon West, of recent years. Since Okami, almost none. And I think even Okami took some flack for doing empirical work on the subject of nudity with children. And his academic peers just started looking at him askance. And I think that's one of the reasons you don't see a lot of these studies, is nobody wants to fund it. Department heads don't want to have anything to do with it. It's perceived as you're a weirdo. If you want, you can do nudity and sex and all kinds of sexual behavior all you want. And that's actually probably smiled upon, but you just don't want to be talking about nudity in kids in academia these days.
Oh yeah, even to establish the safety of it.
I think it's just such an awkward thing for people to even try to do, that a lot of people who want to do the studies are having a hard time doing it and just figure, hey, it's not worth the threat to tenure and getting a job and whatnot to tackle that topic. And they just shift the topics differently.
But is that the end of it? Are naturists doomed to forever advocate for naturism from a position of only having anecdotal evidence to provide? Can science even save us from these stigmas and misconceptions that society holds? Some hope comes from Dr. Keon West, the Goldsmiths professor and researcher who's been the most active in researching these topics in recent years. Last year, he expressed his thoughts to Stefan Deshane on his podcast, The Naturist Living Show.
I do think that simply quantifying these questions is incredibly important and incredibly meaningful. I do think that people should be able to ask these questions. And if there is some harm, we also would like to know what it is. That would be great. If there's quantifiable, detectable harm, then let's detect it and let's quantify it. And I think we always do this. We can do this with other cultures. So there are countries in the world where you could go and they would say, well, what happened? What would you think if your 7-year-old son just saw a woman walking around in the street with their hair out? And we'd say, I don't think anything bad happens to them. What's the bad thing that happens? And they would look at you like you were insane, and they'd be worried about you, and they'd bundle their children together and they'd walk away. But we can't turn that gaze on ourselves and say, when someone else asks us exactly the same question, well, what's the harm that happens when your 7-year-old sees someone walking down the street naked? What's the bad thing itself? We don't have an answer, but we have that same sense of indignation and confusion, and then we leave. And I do think one thing science is really good at is getting us to see beyond our own cultural boundaries and to really examine our fundamental assumptions about what's bad, what happens, what negativity occurs, what positivity occurs, and at the very least to force us to really sit down and define what we think will happen, to really be clear about that, and then having done that, to really measure to see whether it does happen. And I think that's incredibly important to do.
I'd like to thank the Naturist Society Foundation, Nikki Hoffman, Carmen Ham, Mark Storey, and Dennis Craig Smith for their support behind this episode. If you're not already a Naturist Society member, please consider becoming one. Not only does it get you access to a premier magazine and to Mark Storey's excellent Zoom series, but you have the peace of mind of supporting an important group working to positively promote and advocate for naturist rights. I also want to thank Dr. Keon West and Stefan Deshane, who, in addition to featuring Dr. West on his Naturist Living Show podcast, also featured Dennis Craig Smith on an earlier episode. I'll include a link to both of those episodes in the show notes. This episode of Naked Age included music licensed and sourced from Envato Elements. The theme song was composed by me. If you enjoy Naked Age, please head over to your podcast platform of choice and give us a rating and review. Your testimonials help us attract new listeners, and I just love to hear them. Finally, if you appreciate this podcast, or if you follow me and my work on other platforms like Planet Nude, please reach out. Send me a message or at me, or email me at evan@planetnude.co. Thank you for listening to Naked Age. Until next time.